Before we go further, this episode discusses historical psychiatric practices, including institutional abuse, coercive treatments, and the pathologizing of neurodivergent people. Nothing graphic is described, but the emotional weight is real. If you need to pause, pause. Your well-being matters. And as always, nothing here is medical advice. If medication steadies you, if therapy holds you, if support keeps you anchored, that is strength, not betrayal. Take nothing from this story that could harm you. Take only what helps you understand yourself with more dignity. Welcome back, or welcome if this is where you're beginning. Although I gently suggest starting with part 1, the roots matter before the branches. In part 1 we traced the line from the ancient seers to the architects of a new world order, from the sorcerer dancing in firelight to Newton mechanizing the cosmos, from the Heyoka laughing at grief to the philosophers who decided the inner world couldn't be trusted. We ended at the moment the worldview hardened into something more than philosophy. This is part 2, where it hardens into stone walls and iron doors, where the worldview gets people inside it. Before the reformers arrived with their promises, before psychiatry shaped itself into a profession, before anyone called it treatment, Europe already had a system. A system built around containment, around change, not compassion, around order, not understanding. And sometimes, yes, of course, profit. This was not medicine. This was storage, silencing, display. Centuries of brutality wearing the mask of care. Long before diagnoses existed, Europe built madhouses. They were not hospitals as we understand them today. And they weren't only filled with the violently psychotic. They held the grieving, the epileptic, the eccentric, the poor, the difficult, the unwanted, the people whose behavior no longer fitted what society considered acceptable. The boundaries between illness, disability, poverty, difference and inconvenience were dangerously blurry. If you behaved in ways society didn't understand, you could be labelled idiot, lunatic, hysteric, melancholic, and once the label arrived, the person could disappear behind it. Inside these madhouses, people didn't receive treatment. They vanished. Bedlam Royal Hospital, in Bedlam, the most infamous building in Europe. Founded in 1247, rebuilt in the 1600s. By the 1700s, it had become a tourist attraction. Not metaphorically, literally. Thousands of Londoners paid a penny to walk its corridors and watch people suffer. Travel diaries describe naked men chained by the wrists, women raving in their filth, the smell of rot, crowds cheering when a patient screamed. People came to stare. Visitors paid to enter. Tourists wrote about what they saw. Crowds gathered around suffering as though suffering itself were entertainment. Imagine that. Not a museum of art, not a theatre. A building full of human beings turned into an afternoon outing. One patient, James Norris, an American sailor, was found in 1814, confined in an extraordinary iron apparatus. His movements were almost completely restricted. He had reportedly been kept in this condition for years. Imagine being unable to lie down. For years and years. Not punishment, procedure. Bedlam was not the exception, it was the model. In the late 1700s, private madhouses multiplied, and regulation was weak. Too weak. Families could commit relatives under circumstances that today would raise enormous questions. A husband could have enormous power over a wife. A family could decide what happened to a difficult relative. And once someone was inside, getting them back out was another story. For the right circumstances, and sometimes the right payment, a person could disappear behind a locked door. No trial, no investigation, no appeal. Parliament's 1815 inquiry found women committed for opinionated behaviour, children with behaviours that today might be recognised as neurodivergent, could be labelled idiots, imbeciles, feeble-minded, or simply difficult. Widows institutionalised for grieving too long. Mystics recorded as speaking to spirits. People imprisoned for years without cause. This was not medicine. It was social erasure written in ink. The Enlightenment worshipped reason. Inside madhouses, reason looked like violence. These weren't fringe practices. They were endorsed by respected physicians and taught in universities. They called it treatment. Now let's have a look at some of those treatments. The tranquilizer chair. Benjamin Rush, often called the father of American psychiatry, believed disturbances in the brain circulation played a role in madness. His answer was the tranquilizer chair. A patient was strapped down, immobilized, sometimes blindfolded, sometimes gagged, for hours, sometimes days. The theory was that physical restraint could calm an agitated mind. Today it sounds barbaric. At the time it was presented as treatment. He wrote that the silence it forced was therapeutic. The spinning chair. Erasmus Darwin, Charles Darwin's grandfather, experimented with rotational treatments, believing that disturbing the body's equilibrium might somehow reset a disordered nervous system. Patients were spun, sometimes until they became violently sick, sometimes until they collapsed. Doctors were trying to reset the mind by violently rearranging the body. The douche. Not the shower you know today. A douche could mean cold water poured or directed onto the body, sometimes from above, sometimes without warning. The theory was simple. Madness was heat. So cool the body, shock the nerves, reset the mind, and sometimes punish the patient. At some institutions, shower baths were used not simply as treatment, but as discipline, for tearing clothes, for laughing, for striking an attendant, for attempting to escape. There were even treatments designed around surprise. Patients plunged into water without warning, because the shock itself was considered therapeutic. Some lost consciousness, some did not wake. The language was medicine, the mechanism was coercion, and the line between the two was often very, very thin. The bloodletting, a treatment that had been used for centuries and remained popular in psychiatry. Benjamin Rush was one of its most enthusiastic advocates, using it extensively in his psychiatric practice. Pints drained to cool the mind, calm agitation, release disordered humours. The theory was that removing blood could calm an overheated and disordered brain. Sometimes the treatment was worse than the condition it was meant to cure. Blistering and burning. Chemicals or heat applied to the skin in the belief that illness could somehow be drawn away from the mind through the body. The skin blistered. Infections followed. Some patients developed infections. Some died from them. And somewhere along the way this was called medicine. They published diagrams, presented these methods at conferences, called them humane, called them progress. The past is not a foreign country. It is a mirror we rarely want to look into. By the late 1700s and early 1800s, madhouses were bursting. Wards built for 10 held 60, straw soaked in urine, rats gnawing through bedding, lice everywhere. In Paris, the Salpêtrière became a city within a city. Thousands of women passed through its walls. Poor women, orphans, the elderly, the chronically ill, women with epilepsy, women diagnosed with hysteria. A whole population of women living inside an institution that would eventually become one of the most famous laboratories in the history of psychiatry. This was the world the reformers inherited, a world breaking under its own cruelty, and they arrived with promises. The world had grown tired of its own violence. It wanted something cleaner, something that sounded like compassion. Into that moment stepped Philippe Pinel. History remembers him as the man who unchained the mad. The image is famous, iron chains falling from the wrists of men who had worn them for years. It's a beautiful story, and like most beautiful stories, it's more complicated. Because the chains did come off, but Pinel wasn't working alone. Much of the practical work at Bicêtre had already been pushed forward by Jean-Baptiste Poussin, a former patient attendant who believed people could be treated without the brutality that had become normal. Pinel helped turn those ideas into a new philosophy of care. Moral treatment. The belief that the mind could be reached through routine, observation, reason, environment, and human interaction. Compared with what came before, this was a genuine change. But there was another side. The change disappeared. The institution remained. Freedom was still defined by someone else. The doctor decided what was rational. The institution decided what was acceptable. So the story isn't brutality ended. It's more complicated. The visible cage became less visible, and sometimes a quieter form of control is harder to recognize, because at least iron chains are honest about what they are. The reformers didn't dismantle the system. They polished it. And into that polished system stepped the men who would give it science, the diagnosers. The Enlightenment supplied the worldview, but it needed men to enforce it, not priests or judges, observers, men who believed suffering could be categorized, corrected, disciplined into order, men who thought if they could name a mind, they could control it. These are the men who turned philosophy into practice and human difference into diagnosis. We begin where Pinel left off. Pinel's ideas crossed the channel, and in England another reformer was building something different. William Tuke, a Quaker merchant who helped establish the York Retreat. Compared with the brutal asylums of the period, the retreat was radical. No chains, no routine beatings, a quieter environment, gardens, work, structure. The idea was that people could be guided back toward reason through kindness, routine, dignity, and self-control. And here's where the story gets interesting. Because moral treatment was humane compared with what came before, but it was still built around a particular idea. The healthy mind was calm, rational, orderly, controlled. So the question becomes, what happens to the person who simply isn't? The chains were gone, but the ideal of the proper mind was still being constructed. Pinel's student Esquirol became the first classifier of mental states. He believed every behavior could be named, sorted, explained, controlled. He introduced terms like hallucination, monomania, partial delirium. He also reflected the assumptions of his century, including ideas about women's supposed emotional and mental vulnerability. Yes, we all know that as females have had a story, a history, where we are very vulnerable and incapable and our mind is just uncontrollable, right? Hey-ho. His influence helped shape the growing system of state-run asylums in France. By mid-century, France had built a network of institutions designed less for healing than for containment. He normalized lock wards, medical surveillance, file-based identity, lifelong confinement. He didn't invent the asylum. He made it a national instrument. Emil Kraepelin believed psychiatry disorders could be understood through patterns, their symptoms, their progression, their outcomes. He wanted to classify the mind as systematically as a botanist classifies plants. His categories would profoundly shape modern psychiatry. But Kraepelin also lived in an era obsessed with heredity and degeneration. He became involved in the eugenic thinking that was spreading through European science, the belief that some forms of mental illness were rooted in hereditary weakness. And this is where classification becomes dangerous, because once you decide a condition is inherited, you can start asking a darker question. Should the people who carry it be allowed to reproduce? Kraepelin didn't create that question, but his work existed within the scientific culture that helped legitimize it. He didn't fill the asylums, but he helped build the categories through which people were sorted. And Sigmund Freud, remembered as the father of psychoanalysis, the interpreter of dreams, But Freud also changed the way the Western world looked at the inner life. Dreams became clues to the unconscious. Symbols became psychological evidence. Religious experience could be interpreted as wish fulfillment, illusion, or even a kind of collective neurosis. Where an earlier culture might ask, "What does this vision mean?" Freud was more likely to ask, "What does this vision reveal about the person who experienced it?" That is a profound shift. The sacred moved inward, and then it became psychological. The dream became evidence, the vision became interpretation, the unconscious became the new territory. Freud didn't invent the idea that inner experience could be pathological, but he helped make the inner world something that could be analyzed, interpreted, and explained by an expert. Each man believed he was helping, each thought he was bringing order, but together they built the diagnostic system, the asylum system, the surveillance system, the moral correction system, medical authority over emotion. And behind those systems lived the people who fell into their hands, the grieving widow, the visionary poet, the war-haunted soldier, the sensitive mother, the girl who refused marriage, the man who talked to spirits, the woman who cried uncontrollably, the boy who paced, the girl who stared into the distance and hummed. None were asked what their experience meant, only how to stop it. From here the story darkens, because once you can call difference a deficit, you can pathologize resistance, and once you can pathologize resistance, any violence becomes justifiable. 1851, the American South. A Louisiana physician, Dr. Samuel A. Cartwright, sat down to defend slavery using the newest language of authority, medicine. In the New Orleans Medical and Surgical Journal, he announced a psychiatric disorder he claimed was epidemic among enslaved Africans. He called it drapetomania, the disease that makes slaves run away. Oh my God, yes, this was real. It was published, taught, cited, believed. Cartwright insisted enslaved black people were naturally submissive, and that any desire for freedom was evidence of mental illness. Of course. He wrote, "If the Negro becomes dissatisfied or attempts to flee, the cause is mental disease." Running was a symptom. Grief was a symptom. Silence, rebellion, withdrawal, all symptoms. This wasn't medicine. It was slavery in a lab coat. Cartwright listed his diagnostic criteria: sulkiness, disobedience, refusal to work, complaints of ill treatment, running away, appearing withdrawn, rebellion against punishment. In other words, trauma responses became diagnostic criteria. Autonomy became evidence of disease. It was a worldview designed to keep an entire people broken into obedience. His proposed treatment was torture, whipping in moderation, ritual humiliation, restraint of children, constant surveillance, forced submission practices, punishment for sadness, mutilation of feet to prevent escape. He described these with the calm precision of a physician writing a prescription. Because once rebellion is an illness, punishment becomes treatment. Cartwright's ideas were published in a medical journal and circulated within the racial ideology of American slavery. They were not a harmless eccentricity. They gave the language of medicine to the logic of slavery. The desire for freedom could be renamed as disease. Resistance could become a symptom. And once rebellion is called an illness, punishment can be dressed up as treatment. Drapetomania was not a mistake. It was a blueprint, because it reveals a pattern that repeats across centuries. When the oppressed resist, the powerful diagnose. A woman cries too loudly, hysteria. A child rocks, defective. A visionary hears voices, labeled insane. A queer person loves, deviance. A black person flees enslavement, drapetomania. The logic is always the same. Your reaction to injustice is irrational. Your pain is pathological. Your refusal is illness. If the oppressed are disordered, the oppressor becomes the healer. It is the darkest alchemy psychiatry ever performed, turning rebellion into disease and domination into virtue. Drapetomania disappeared from medical language, but the pattern it represented didn't disappear so easily. The habit of interpreting resistance as pathology has appeared in many different forms. The words change. The question is whether the underlying logic does. He didn't comply. She escalated. He's oppositional. She's unstable. He's aggressive. She's defiant. These are the modern echoes of that 1851 diagnosis. The belief that resistance is pathology, that trauma is irrational, that refusal is a symptom. You cannot understand racial profiling, school discipline, policing, risk assessments, the criminalization of emotion, or the history of diagnosis without passing through this corridor. And while the American South medicalized rebellion, Europe was busy medicalizing women. In Paris, a man turned trauma into performance and suffering into spectacle. Jean-Martin Charcot. Before Freud turned dreams into diagnosis, before the 20th century turned women into case studies, there was a stage in Paris where suffering was rehearsed, performed, photographed, and renamed as science. The Salpêtrière, a city of locked women, 4,000 of them, poor women, traumatized women, girls and women who today might be recognized as autistic or otherwise neurodivergent, women with epilepsy, widows, orphans, survivors of assault, women who resisted, who dissociated, women who felt too deeply. They weren't patients, they were material, taken, shaped, displayed. And Jean-Martin Charcot turned their pain into a spectacle. He believed hysteria was a neurological disorder that unfolded in a predictable sequence. He claimed every true hysteric followed 4 stages, and if she didn't, he coached her until she did. What he called disease was the choreography of trauma, repeated under hypnosis and fear. The first stage, the body collapses. Charcot insisted hysteria opened with a seizure-like storm, a sudden fall, rigidity, strangely synchronized convulsions, breath that stuttered or caught. To him, this was proof of neurological instability. To us, it is the language of a body in terror, a dissociative break, a triggered memory, a trauma reflex. The first crack in a life held together too tightly. The second stage, the body speaks the unspoken. This was Charcot's favorite, the one who filled the lecture halls, the dramatic postures, the sudden arcs of the spine, the frozen statue-like contortions, the limbs held in impossible balance. He called it clownism, mocking what he saw as theatrical exaggeration. He didn't understand that trauma speaks through shape, that the body reenacts what the mouth cannot say. It curls, bends, stiffens, recoils, carrying memory in its architecture. Women weren't performing, they were remembering. The third stage, the emotion breaks surface. Once the body exhausted itself, the emotions burst forth. Fear, grief, pleading, rage, ecstatic relief, childlike gestures. He called these attitudes passionnelles, as if grief were a posture, as if terror were a pose. But this was the moment women finally showed what lived beneath. The trauma, the violation, the abandonment, the sensory overwhelm, the grief no one had ever believed. Charcot mistook expression for exhibition. The fourth stage, the mind goes where it's safer. In dreamlike speech, symbolic fragments, visions, trance, confusion, collapse, he saw proof of disease. He missed the truth. It was dissociation, a mind escaping a world that would not listen, a sanctuary built in crisis. Women weren't delirious, they were retreating. Every week Charcot held public lessons, demonstrations disguised as science, entertainment disguised as medicine, a packed amphitheatre, doctors sweating under the heat, artists ready to sketch every posture, journalists sharpening their pens, young medical students, Freud included, elbowing through the crowd. And then the women are brought out, some trembling, some sedated, some staring into nothing, dissociated so deeply they are barely present, some holding themselves rigid, knowing a wrong move means punishment. Charcot announces them. "This is Augustine. This is Blanche. This is Genevieve." Not as people, as exhibits. He triggers their trauma responses with touch, light, cold metal, suggestion. Their bodies do the rest. Contemporary accounts describe audiences applauding the spectacle of women breaking. Augustine was 15 when she entered the Salpêtrière. Her history included trauma and abuse. Her symptoms were documented, photographed, studied and displayed. Charcot saw hysteria. Today a clinician might ask very different questions. Was this trauma, dissociation, neurological illness, a combination? We cannot know with certainty, but we do know this. A teenage girl with a history of trauma became a medical spectacle. Her body was observed. Her reactions were classified. Her suffering became evidence. And whatever was happening inside her, the institution had already decided what it meant. Every Tuesday a crowd of men gathered. The attendants brought Augustine on stage. Pale, shaking, already half dissociated from the noise, the lights, the dozens of male eyes. Charcot would tap her shoulder, or utter a cue word, or flash a light, or press a cold instrument to her spine, and her body would do the rest. Not because she was suggestible, but because she was terrified, traumatized, conditioned, and trapped in the same building as the man who controlled her entire world. Her body curved into the famous arc the circle, a dramatic back-arching posture now recognized in a range of neurological and trauma-related conditions. She screamed without sound, a freeze response. She convulsed, seizure-like episodes that today might be explored through the lenses of trauma, dissociation, or functional neurological disorders. She collapsed into attendants' arms, dissociative shutdown. Every reaction was genuine. Not every interpretation was. The men saw performance. They did not see a child reenacting her trauma over and over for an audience that called it science. Charcot wrote, "This is hysteria in its purest form." He was wrong. What he witnessed was trauma displayed under captivity. Augustine tried to escape twice. One by disguising herself as a man, a cap, a coat, boots, far too big for her feet. She made it all the way to the gate. She was caught and dragged back, labelled relapsing, placed under stricter control, punished for trying to reclaim her own life. Her file ends abruptly, a few scattered notes, and then nothing. History swallowed her. The girl who shaped the world's idea of hysteria vanished into institutional silence. Her absence is the loudest part of her story. Before the world called her the Queen of Hysterics, Blanche Whitman was a young woman from poverty, abused by her employer, discarded by society, and delivered to the Salpêtrière as if trauma were a crime. She arrived at 21, fragile, brilliant, responsive, shattered. Charcot adored her, not as a person, as material. She had what he valued: high hypnotic susceptibility, dramatic dissociative seizures, a body that displayed trauma with a clarity the men in the lecture hall found fascinating. Soon she became the star of the Tuesday lectures, her back arched in the rigid arc the circle, fingers clawing at invisible attackers, eyes rolled upward in trance, mouth open in a silent scream that was once a real scream, before the Salpêtrière trained her out of recognizable emotion. Artists sketched her, photographers posed her, doctors memorized her contortions like scripture. Her suffering became the template for European medical instruction. Her body became the diagram. Her trauma became a curriculum. Her name became a brand. In 1893, Charcot collapsed in his office and never rose again. But after his death, Blanche didn't simply disappear. She moved into another scientific world, radiology. The technology was new, the dangers were poorly understood, and Blanche worked in an environment where radiation exposure was common and safety standards were primitive. Over time, the damage became catastrophic. She suffered severe radiation injuries. Parts of her body were amputated. The woman, once displayed as a psychiatric specimen, had become a casualty of another scientific frontier. First her mind had been studied, then her body, and in both cases the institution found something it could use. Blanche Whitman was the most famous hysteric in Europe and the most exploited radiology subject in France. She was not cured, she was consumed, first by trauma, then by Charcot's spectacle, then by early radiology's hunger for data, then by the quiet machinery of a hospital that knew how to recycle a woman into whatever the next scientific frontier required. She died in 1913, not as a cured patient, not as a famed performer, but as a casualty of the very science that once claimed to reveal her truth. If Augustine was the child and Blanche the instrument, Geneviève was something else. A reminder that people inside institutions were never just passive subjects, they were observers too. Geneviève became one of Charcot's celebrated patients at the Salpêtrière. Like Augustine and Blanche, she appeared during the famous public demonstrations. Doctors photographed her, artists sketched her, medical journals reproduced her image across Europe. She became part of the visual language that convinced the world hysteria had a recognizable face. Charcot believed hypnosis revealed the hidden machinery of disease, but Geneviève complicated that story. Unlike the ideal patient, she did not always disappear into suggestion. Accounts from the period suggest she sometimes remembered what happened during hypnosis, questioned parts of the process, and eventually refused to continue participating. Whether she was resisting Charcot himself or simply reclaiming control of her own body, something had shifted. The performance was no longer entirely under the doctor's direction. She reminds us of something history often forgets. Patients were not blank pages waiting for physicians to write upon them. They negotiated, they adapted, they survived. Sometimes they complied, sometimes they resisted, and sometimes the smallest refusal said more than an entire medical textbook. By the end of the 19th century, even Charcot's own ideas were beginning to fracture. Researchers like Pierre Janet started recognizing dissociation as something more complex than simple hysteria. Others argued that suggestion itself played a powerful role inside the Salpêtrière. The certainty that had filled Charcot's lecture theatre began to dissolve. Charcot believed he had discovered a female disorder, predictable neurological stages, scientific patterns of emotional display, universal laws of hysteria. History tells us a more complicated story. Many of the women he studied had survived sexual violence, childhood abuse, poverty, loss, institutionalization, or experiences we would now recognize through the lenses of trauma and dissociation. He documented behaviours. He rarely understood the lives that produced them. His students eventually carried the story in different directions. Pierre Janet developed pioneering work on dissociation and traumatic memory. Freud initially acknowledged the role of sexual trauma before later moving towards theories centered on unconscious fantasy. The conversation changed, but the women whose suffering built those conversations were rarely invited into them. Charcot believed photography would provide objective evidence. Instead, it often preserved carefully staged moments. Patients were posed, scenes were arranged, images were selected to fit the theories of the day. Those photographs traveled across Europe. Doctors studied them, artists copied them, the public consumed them, and they helped create a cultural image of the emotional, irrational, hysterical woman, an image whose influence echoes far beyond the walls of the Salpêtrière. The theatre lights dim, the women leave the stage. For decades, medicine had insisted that trembling, collapse, dissociation, and emotional overwhelm belonged mostly to women. Then the 20th century arrived, and war forced the same profession to watch hundreds of thousands of men break in exactly the same ways. The logic of hysteria was about to collide with the trenches. Before the 20th century, the world had never seen anything like the First World War. Never had human beings built machines designed to break the mind before they broke the body. Never had the landscape itself become a living graveyard, a corridor of craters, wire, smoke, and the constant metallic shriek of shells. Millions marched to the trenches with the confidence of the Enlightenment in their veins, the belief that man was master of nature, master of emotion, master of himself. The trenches corrected that belief, because no philosophy is stronger than a shell landing 10 feet away. No theory overpowers a human nervous system pushed past its breaking point. The trenches preached a new gospel. A mind can be wounded without a drop of blood. Doctors expected wounds. They expected amputations, blood loss, infection, fever. They did not expect men arriving from the front lines uninjured in body, yet shattered in ways no wound could explain. Uncontrollable shaking, 1,000-yard stares, muteness, paralysis, hysterical blindness, hysterical deafness, vomiting at the sound of metal, dissociative wandering, rocking, tremors that lasted hours, memory stuck on endless repeat, dreams that choked men awake, hallucinations of shells never fired. These reactions were new in human history, only new to a world that believed suffering must produce a measurable injury. So the system did what it always does. It invented a name. Shell shock, a tidy mechanical label for a soul that had fallen out of its body. The military hated diagnosis. A traumatized soldier was a malfunction in the war machine. So the language shifted. Lack of moral fiber, malingering, nervous weakness, effeminacy, cowardice. The irony? It was often the most sensitive, empathetic, perceptive men, the ones who noticed danger first, the ones wired to react deeply, who shattered under endless horror. Not because they were weak, because they were alive. But the system demanded steel, so it punished flesh. 306 British and Commonwealth servicemen were executed during the First World War for offences including desertion and cowardice. Some may have been suffering what we would today recognize as trauma-related psychological injury, but they were not diagnosed with PTSD. The diagnosis didn't exist. They were simply labelled cowards and shot. Their crimes: running during bombardment, refusing to return to trenches filled with corpses, shaking too violently to load a rifle, collapsing into dissociation, going blind from terror. Shot at dawn, buried quietly, families told sanitized lies. Decades later, the British government issued a posthumous pardon to hundreds of those executed. Too late to help the men, but perhaps not too late to change the story told about them. Because armies needed functioning bodies, psychiatry turned experimental and brutal. The Faradic therapy, electric currents applied to the body, sometimes in extremely coercive ways, isolation in dark cells to reset the nerves, forced marches on broken minds, artillery recordings played near traumatized men to habituate them, food restriction to enforce obedience, hypnosis under duress, forcing men to relive trauma again and again. This wasn't care. It was coercion under the banner of medicine. And yet, in the corners the system ignored, one man finally listened. At Craiglockhart Hospital, W.H.R. Rivers treated war poets and soldiers with something the era considered radical: gentleness. He believed trauma had to be faced, remembered, and understood, not beaten out of the patient. His approach became an important early example of what we might now recognize as trauma-informed care. But Rivers was the exception. For every Craiglockhart, there were 100 wards where the answer to a shattered mind was a shock, a cell, or a firing squad at dawn, and the men who suffered inside those wards deserved to be named. Private Harry Farr, bombardment survivor, shook so violently he couldn't stand, begged not to return to the line, executed for cowardice in 1916, and pardoned posthumously in 2006. Lieutenant Wilfred Owen, one of the greatest war poets. He gave language to wounds medicine still struggled to name. Diagnosed with shell shock, returned to battle, died 1 week before armistice. Some soldiers were treated with electric shocks. Some were subjected to painful stimulation intended to force speech or movement back into the body. The message was clear: recover or else. Shell shock forced a forbidden question. What if madness is the mind's sane response to an insane environment? The system refused. Doctors debated male hysteria, hereditary weakness, sterilization, execution, discipline. Almost no one asked, what happened to you? It took until 1980 for psychiatry to formally recognize post-traumatic stress disorder as a diagnosis. Nearly 7 decades after shell shock first appeared in the trenches. A diagnosis built from the bones of men the system broke, and then blamed. Shell shock was the collision between ancient nervous systems and modern machinery. War punished the very traits ancestral worlds once valued: hyper-awareness, rapid reaction, deep emotional processing, empathetic attunement, pattern recognition of danger. The industrial world called these defects. The trenches revealed their cost. And once society learned that shattered minds could be punished, discipline experimented on, the path toward what came next was already lit. And there we leave it, for now. Thank you for staying with me through this descent, from Bedlam's penny tours to the Salpêtrière's Tuesday lectures, from Augustine's file that ends in silence to the soldiers shot at dawn for the crime of surviving, from the men who named suffering to the men who punished it, to the one quiet man at Craiglockhart who finally asked the right question. If you need to rest before part 3, rest. Move your body, step outside, stretch. Let the air remind you that you are here, and you are whole, and not what they tried to name you. Maybe the older stories we have about minds like ours were not diagnoses. Maybe they were descriptions, roles, gifts, warnings, callings. And perhaps somewhere along the way we forgot how many different ways a human mind can exist. Follow Bloodline on Spotify, or wherever you listen to your podcast. Leave a rating, a comment. Let me know your opinions on the podcast, on the episodes, which threads make you tinkle more, if there's any threads that you have to share. Also, thank you so much for getting in touch and checking on me. I am fine. I am coping better, but I have moved out of Castelo Branco. That I found the summer there is very extreme. I don't think I can survive up there. So I am towards the center now in Coimbra area, and I've been coping much, much better. And thank you for your concern. Really appreciate it from the heart. Follow on Instagram at Bloodline Myths, on TikTok at Bloodline, a story we forgot to tell, and on YouTube channel. Part 3 will be out in 3 weeks. Until then, rock when you need to, dream when you can, and remember, a label is a description. It is not the whole of you. Bye!